The talk show host thought he had the upper hand until Pam Bondi flipped the conversation, leaving him scrambling for a comeback. The studio lights were blinding, hotter than she expected. Pam Bondi had been on television countless times, debated high-profile cases, and stood before crowds of reporters. But today felt different. There was a tension in the air, a quiet edge that sent a message before a single word was spoken. She adjusted her blazer, keeping her posture straight as she sat across from Leighton, the host of the exchange. A sharp dresser with a reputation for pushing his guests to their limits. Graham was known for his aggressive questioning, his refusal to back down, and his tendency to turn interviews into public interrogations. Pam had been invited under the premise of a conversation about law, justice, and her time as Florida's Attorney General. But from the moment she walked onto the set, she could tell that wasn't the real plan. The energy in the room was off, cold, expectant, like the audience was waiting for a fight. She glanced toward them briefly, a sea of eager faces under dimmed house lights. Some leaned forward, intrigued. Others sat stiffly, arms crossed, skeptical. A producer counted down from 3. The red light on the camera flickered on. Graham leaned in with a practiced smile, a tight-lipped expression that never quite reached his eyes. "Pam, welcome to the exchange." She returned a polite nod. "Thank you for having me." His fingers tapped lightly against the desk, his voice smooth but with an unmistakable bite. "You've been at the center of controversy for quite some time. Your tenure as Attorney General, your political stances, some would say you've made decisions that hurt more people than they helped. Would you say that's fair?" There it was. No easing in, no warm-up. A sharp, pointed question right out of the gate. Pam had dealt with this kind of approach before, but something about Graham's tone made it clear he wasn't interested in a discussion. He was looking for a confrontation. She knew the audience had caught it too. She kept her expression neutral, unfazed. "I'd say that's an oversimplification of years of work, but if you'd like to discuss specifics, I'm happy to." Graham gave a tight smirk, tilting his head slightly. "Oh, we'll get to specifics." He turned to the camera as if addressing the audience directly. "But let's start with something simple. A lot of people, particularly those who have been affected by your policies, feel that you're out of touch with the realities of everyday Americans. That you've prioritized your own political gains over what's right. Do you ever stop to think about the people on the other side of your decisions?" It wasn't a real question. It was bait. Pam knew better than to bite. She folded her hands neatly on the desk. "Every decision I've made has been with the intention of upholding the law and protecting citizens. That doesn't mean everyone agrees with me, but leadership isn't about being liked. It's about doing what's necessary, even when it's unpopular." Graham let out a small chuckle, shaking his head. "That's convenient. But let's be honest, Pam." He leaned forward, his voice dropping slightly. "Some would say you've turned a blind eye to justice when it suited you." The room felt smaller. The audience was dead silent now, hanging on every word. Pam remained still, her pulse steady. She'd seen this tactic before. Force an emotional reaction, make the guest defensive, get them flustered. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction. Instead, she took a slow breath and met his gaze directly. "You seem eager to make this personal, Graham. I hope you'll allow me to actually answer your questions instead of just throwing accusations." A few murmurs rippled through the audience. Graham's expression flickered, just for a second, but he wasn't finished, and he was about to make things even uglier. Graham didn't miss a beat. He had played this game before, controlled. The pacing steered the conversation, forced his guests into a corner before they even realized what was happening. He leaned back, crossing one leg over the other, as if settling in for a performance. "Pam, let's talk about power. People in your position, politicians, prosecutors, you all claim to serve justice. But it seems justice often bends for those who already have influence. Pam kept her posture firm, waiting. Graham continued, his tone sharpening. For instance, when you were Attorney General, there were claims that corporate donors got special treatment. Investigations that quietly disappeared. People who should have been held accountable, walking away untouched. Can you look this audience in the eye and say that never happened? A trap, cleverly worded. A denial would be met with skepticism, an admission twisted beyond recognition. Pam exhaled through her nose, keeping her voice even. Graham, if you're going to make accusations, at least have the integrity to be specific. What cases are you referring to? Graham smirked, turning toward the camera like he was performing for the viewers at home. Oh, we'll get specific, don't worry. The audience chuckled, but it wasn't the kind of laughter that felt light. It was expectant, hungry for a slip-up. Pam could feel the rhythm of the conversation shifting, the temperature in the room rising. He was painting her as someone squirming under the pressure, when in reality, she hadn't even begun to push back. Graham glanced down at a stack of papers in front of him, a prop. Whether or not he actually needed them was irrelevant. They gave the illusion of damning evidence waiting to be revealed. He flipped through them dramatically. Let's start with this. Back in your tenure, there was a lawsuit against a certain corporation, one of your donors, mind you, accused of fraudulent business practices. And then suddenly that lawsuit vanished. What a coincidence. Pam's lips pressed together. Now she knew exactly what he was referring to and how he was twisting it. She started to speak, but Graham cut her off. Tell me, Pam, why should the American people believe that people like you don't just protect the wealthy while the rest of us get left behind? That landed like a punch. The audience murmured. Pam felt it immediately. This was the moment he had been waiting for. A loaded question designed to make her defensive, to force her into a soundbite he could use against her. She could see it in his eyes. He thought he had her, but he underestimated her. Pam inhaled slowly, letting the silence hang in the air just long enough to make him uncomfortable. Then she leaned forward slightly. You know, Graham, it's interesting how you frame things. He blinked, just barely, but she caught it. You present this case like it's some scandal, when in reality it was fully investigated and the claims didn't hold up. No cover-up, no backroom deals, just the legal process playing out as it should. But that wouldn't make for a very exciting headline, would it? The audience shifted. She could hear whispers. The weight in the room had started to shift. But Graham wasn't done. He never expected a guest to roll over, and he knew how to keep pressing. So you're saying money never influenced any of your decisions? Pam met his stare. I'm saying facts did. And I find it interesting that instead of discussing those facts, you'd rather insinuate corruption with no proof. The audience reacted, some nodding, some still wary. But the tide wasn't as clearly in Graham's favor anymore. He could feel it too. So he changed tactics. His next question was about to get personal, and that's where he made his biggest mistake. Graham's smirk widened. He could feel the moment slipping, the weight of the conversation tilting against him, and he wasn't about to let that happen. If the political angle wasn't enough to rattle Pam, he had another card to play. He shifted in his seat, his voice taking on a more casual, almost amused tone. Let's put politics aside for a moment. Let's talk about character. Pam didn't react. She knew where this was going. Graham tilted his head slightly. You've built a reputation as a tough prosecutor, a woman who stands by her principles. But what happens when those principles only seem to apply when it's convenient? The audience tensed. He continued, his voice dripping with feigned curiosity. You talk about justice, about the law being fair. But do you remember the protests outside that movie theater in Tampa? Because a lot of people do. A shift in the room. Pam knew exactly what he was referring to. It had been a hot summer evening. She had gone to see a documentary. Nothing political, nothing controversial. But outside the theater, a group of protesters had been waiting. They shouted insults, called her a disgrace, accused her of ignoring their concerns. And then, as she walked past them, someone spat at her. It had been caught on camera, circulated for days. Some had called it justified outrage. Others had called it assault. Pam's jaw tightened slightly, but she kept her voice controlled. "Yes, I remember." Graham leaned in. People were angry. Some of them had lost everything because of policies you defended. And instead of engaging, you walked away. "Some would say that's cowardly." Murmurs rippled through the audience. Pam felt a familiar frustration creeping in. He wasn't interested in the truth, just the most scandalous version of it. She exhaled slowly. "Let's be clear, Graham. You're talking about a situation where I was harassed in public, where I was physically assaulted. Are you suggesting I should have stood there and taken it?" Graham raised an eyebrow, his expression unreadable. Pam continued, her voice sharper now. "Because if you are, I'd love to hear you say it plainly. Let's not dance around it. Let's hear you defend mob intimidation on national television." Silence. For the first time, Graham hesitated. The audience was no longer just watching a guest on the defensive. They were seeing a host who had just been called out. He shifted slightly but quickly recovered. "I'm saying that when people are desperate, they do desperate things. And when leaders refuse to engage with them, they feel abandoned." Pam didn't break eye contact. Desperation doesn't justify violence. Would you say the same if that had been someone else in my position? If it had been a journalist or a politician you agree with? Or do different rules apply depending on the target? More murmurs. Graham exhaled through his nose, clearly irritated now. "So you're playing the victim?" Pam leaned back slightly. "I don't have to. The footage speaks for itself. But if you'd like to have a conversation about the real issues instead of twisting events for drama, I'm happy to." A beat of silence. Graham shifted, flipping a page in his notes. But the energy in the room had changed. Pam wasn't just pushing back, she was taking control. But Graham wasn't about to let that stand, and so he made his second mistake. Graham inhaled sharply, glancing down at his notes as if recalibrating. The cracks in his confidence were subtle, but they were there. He wasn't used to losing control of an interview. Pam, on the other hand, was steady, watching, waiting, and ready. But Graham wasn't giving up. If a personal attack hadn't shaken her, he'd go for something bigger. He set his papers down, laced his fingers together, and fixed Pam with a look that was almost pitying. "All right, let's be honest here, Pam. You have a history of defending people and policies that a lot of Americans, frankly, the majority, find problematic. If you weren't in politics, if you didn't have power, do you really think you'd be standing here today? Or would you be just another person left behind by the very system you upheld?" It was a clever pivot, designed to make her look out of touch, privileged, detached from the struggles of everyday Americans. Pam saw right through it. She tilted her head slightly. "That's an interesting argument, Graham. You're saying that because I worked in the system, I somehow don't understand it?" He smirked, sensing an opening. "I'm saying you benefited from it." Pam leaned forward. "You seem to have a lot of opinions about my past. So let me ask you something. What's your definition of justice?" Graham's smile faltered. "Excuse me," she gestured toward him. "You sit here, implying corruption, implying favoritism, implying that I got where I am because of privilege. So tell me, how do you define justice? Is it about who shouts the loudest? Who makes the most accusations? Or is it about facts?" Graham's lips parted slightly as if searching for a response. Pam didn't give him a chance. "Because, Graham, If you're so confident that the system is broken, I'd love to hear your solution. You've had plenty of time to criticize me. But what exactly would you do differently? Silence. A slow murmur rippled through the audience. Graham's fingers curled slightly against the desk. That's not my job, Pam. She nodded. Exactly. Your job is to stir controversy, to frame things a certain way, to make people think there's always a scandal, always a conspiracy. But let's get real. You don't actually care about justice. You care about making a spectacle. The audience's reaction was immediate. A few gasps, some murmured approval. Graham blinked, his composure slipping for the first time. Pam sat back. So if we're done playing games, I'd love to actually talk about the issues. But if you just want sound bites, let me know. I'd hate to waste your time. The tension in the studio was suffocating. For the first time since the interview started, Graham looked caught, like he hadn't planned for this moment, like he didn't expect her to flip the script so effectively. He glanced at the camera, then back at Pam, exhaling through his nose. All right, he said, his voice noticeably tighter. Let's talk about the issues. But he wasn't in control anymore, and the audience knew it. Graham's fingers drummed lightly against the desk, a sign he was recalibrating. This wasn't going how he had planned. He was supposed to be the one controlling the tempo, steering the conversation, keeping his guest on the defensive. But somehow Pam had turned the tide, and now the weight of the room wasn't on his side. He forced a smile, though it was noticeably tighter than before. All right, Pam. You want to talk about facts? Let's talk about facts. Pam nodded, waiting. Graham flipped through his notes again, though the gesture felt more like a stall tactic than a necessary step. You've been in the legal world for years. Prosecutor, attorney general, consultant. A lot of power, a lot of influence. Yet, somehow every time controversy arises, you manage to come out clean. Some people might find that suspicious. Pam raised an eyebrow. Are you accusing me of something? Graham spread his hands. I'm saying the average person doesn't have that luxury. When they get tangled up in the legal system, they don't walk away unscathed. Pam's expression didn't waver. The law isn't about luxury, Graham. It's about how well you understand it and how you navigate it. That applies to everyone, including me. Graham smirked again, but it was weaker this time. That's easy to say when you have the resources to fight back. Pam exhaled slowly. You're right. Not everyone has the same resources. But that's why understanding the law matters. That's why due process exists. That's why cases can't be tried based on public outrage or headlines. Graham opened his mouth, but Pam wasn't finished. In fact, that's exactly what we're doing right now, isn't it? You're not interested in facts. You're interested in framing me as some kind of privileged elite who dodges accountability. But you have no proof, no case, just vague accusations meant to stir the pot. The audience murmured again. The shift was undeniable now. Graham's jaw clenched slightly, just for a fraction of a second. He was losing them. He could feel it. Pam tilted her head slightly. So tell me, Graham, what do you actually want from this conversation? Do you want to discuss real issues, or are we just here to entertain the people at home with a one-sided spectacle? Graham inhaled sharply, shifting in his seat. I think the people at home want transparency. Pam nodded. Great. Then let's be transparent. Let's talk about why you keep interrupting me, why you frame things a certain way, why instead of discussing policy, you prefer to throw out accusations without evidence. More murmurs. Some audience members actually nodded now. Pam continued. Because, Graham, if your goal was to have a real discussion, you wouldn't be doing this. Graham forced a laugh. I'm just asking tough questions, Pam. She gave him a knowing smile. No, you're trying to make a headline. Silence. Graham glanced toward the producer as if looking for an out, but there wasn't one. The room was no longer hanging on his words, it was hanging on hers. And then, from the back of the audience, someone started clapping. It was hesitant at first, a single person. But then, another joined in, and another. The applause grew, rippling, across the room. It wasn't an explosive standing ovation, but it didn't have to be. Because in that moment, it was clear who had won. Graham swallowed. He straightened his papers again, but it was just to keep his hands busy. The interview wasn't over yet, but it might as well have been. Pam Bondi had just turned the tables, and everyone in the room knew it. Graham cleared his throat, forcing a tight-lipped smile as the applause finally died down. His grip on the conversation had slipped through his fingers, and now there was no getting it back. Pam sat still, composed. She wasn't gloating, she wasn't smirking. She had made her point, and the audience had seen it for themselves. Graham tried to salvage what was left. "Well, Pam, it seems you've certainly made an impression here today." She met his gaze. "I tend to do that." A flicker of irritation crossed his face, but he covered it quickly. He knew he had to wrap things up without making it obvious that he had lost control. "Well," he said, shifting his papers as if the interview had gone exactly as he planned, "I think that's about all the time we have. I appreciate you coming on and giving your perspective." Pam nodded. "I appreciate the opportunity. Next time maybe we can have an actual discussion instead of a performance." The audience chuckled. Graham gave a strange smile but didn't respond. He turned to the camera, his voice slightly tighter than before. "That was Pam Bondi, former Attorney General of Florida. We'll be right back after this." The moment the red recording light switched off, Graham pushed back his chair and stood rubbing the bridge of his nose. The control room buzzed in his earpiece, but he ignored it. Pam stood as well, smoothing out her blazer. She turned to Graham, her tone polite but firm. "If you ever decide you actually want a real conversation, let me know." He let out a quiet scoff. "I ask the questions that people want answered." Pam gave a small smile. "No, you ask the questions that get clicks." And with that, she turned and walked off set. The second she stepped into the hallway, she was met with a flood of messages on her phone. Notifications blew up: Twitter, Facebook, news alerts. She tapped on a trending topic: Pam Bondi Unfiltered. Clips of the interview had already hit social media. People were dissecting every moment, her pushback, Graham's struggle to recover, the audience's shift in energy. Some called it a takedown, others called it the rare moment when a guest refused to be steamrolled by a hostile interviewer. She scrolled past a few tweets. "I don't care what you think of Pam Bondi. This is how you handle a setup." Graham thought he had the upper hand until Pam Bondi flipped the script. That was brutal. This interview was a masterclass in staying calm under pressure. Watch and learn. There were critics too, of course, people twisting her words, trying to frame her as evasive, defensive. But the narrative was clear. She hadn't just survived the interview. She had owned it. As she stepped outside into the cool evening air, she took a deep breath. This was politics. This was media. And if there was one thing she had learned, it was that no matter how hard someone tries to control the conversation, the truth always finds its way through. Moments like these remind us why staying composed under pressure matters. When faced with hostility, it's easy to get defensive, easy to lose your temper. But strength isn't just about fighting back, it's about knowing how to fight back. Pam Bondi didn't win that interview by yelling or getting angry. She won by staying sharp, refusing to be baited, and making sure the audience saw exactly what was happening. It's a lesson for anyone watching. Stay calm. Stay focused, and when the world tries to put words in your mouth, make sure you're the one controlling the narrative. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe for more in-depth stories and analysis. And tell us, have you ever been in a situation where you had to stand your ground? Let us know in the comments.